the paramedics brought Daniel Reyes into University College Hospital at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. He was sitting upright on the stretcher, which confused the triage nurse. Most emergencies arrive horizontal. He was calm. That was the second thing that confused her. His hands were folded in his lap, his breathing was steady, and he was staring straight ahead with an expression she later described to a colleague as someone watching a film they'd already seen. He was 31 years old. He was wearing a jacket he'd bought 6 months ago and never got around to breaking in. None of that mattered. What mattered was that in his left eye, the central field of vision had collapsed entirely, and in his right, a spreading grey blur had eaten through the middle of everything he looked at, leaving only the edges, outlines without centres, shapes without faces. He had not been in an accident. He had not been assaulted. There was no tumour, no stroke, no inherited disease lurking in his family history. The registrar on duty that night ran through the standard checklist in under 4 minutes and came up empty every time. She ordered imaging. She called the on-call ophthalmologist. She stood in the corridor outside Daniel's bay and tried to remember if she'd ever seen bilateral central vision loss in a 31-year-old with no trauma history and no prior diagnosis. She hadn't. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. The ophthalmologist arrived at 1:15 in the morning. She examined both eyes under magnification, took photographs of the retina, and went very quiet in the way that doctors go quiet when they recognize something they were not expecting to find. The macula, the small central region of the retina responsible for reading, for faces, for fine detail, showed lesions in both eyes. Not identical lesions. The left was further gone, but both were there, both were real, and both had been caused by something that was, at that moment, sitting in the left pocket of Daniel's unbroken-in jacket, hanging on the hook behind his curtain. A small amber bottle, 60 millilitres, a red cap slightly worn from being opened and closed several hundred times, a label printed in a font that looked like it had been designed in 2003 and never updated, with a product name that sounded like a cologne, something with the word rush in it, or blast, or power, the kind of name that sounds like it means something without meaning anything at all. And at the bottom corner of the label, a small skull and crossbone sticker, slightly crooked, the adhesive starting to peel. Someone had put that sticker there as a joke years ago at a party. Daniel had kept it. That bottle was not illegal. It had been purchased without a prescription, without an ID check, without any form of age verification, from a website that also sold massage oils and scented candles. It had arrived in a plain padded envelope 3 days after he ordered it, and the customs declaration on the outside listed the contents as room fragrance. The bottle itself was labelled in small print on the back panel as a room odorizer, not for human consumption. That phrase, not for human consumption, was doing an enormous amount of work. It was the only barrier between the product and complete legal exposure. It was a label, not a warning. It was a shield, not information. The ophthalmologist had seen this before, not often, but enough. She had a folder on her desktop at the clinic with a name that 6 months earlier she'd not needed to use more than twice a year. By the time Daniel arrived in her emergency bay, that folder contained 41 patient files. 41 people, all with the same pattern of retinal damage, all with the same history, all holding, in some version, the same small amber bottle. The medical term for what was happening to Daniel and those 41 others is Popper's maculopathy. Most people have never heard of it. Most of the people currently using the product that causes it have never heard of it either. The product itself, The category of chemicals sold in those amber bottles under names like Rush, Jungle Juice, Iron Fist, Blue Boy, and Amsterdam has been part of gay nightlife for 50 years. 50 years of use, and only now in clinics across London, Paris, Brussels and Toronto are doctors quietly filling folders with cases that look exactly like Daniel's. Something changed. Not the users, not the culture, not the clubs, or the ritual, or the reasons people reach for the bottle. Something inside the bottle changed, and almost no one was told. Daniel lay in that hospital bay for 4 hours before his flatmate arrived. He hadn't called anyone himself. His flatmate had found the note Daniel left on the kitchen counter, 3 words written in handwriting that tilted slightly to the left because his right eye was already struggling with depth. The flatmate arrived red-faced and out of breath, and found Daniel still sitting upright, still with his hands folded, still staring at the curtain with the expression of someone working through a problem they weren't sure had a solution. By morning, the imaging results were back. By mid-morning, the ophthalmologist had a name for what she was looking at in both eyes. By the afternoon, she had the conversation with Daniel that she'd now had, in various forms, 41 times before, and each time the part that landed hardest was not the diagnosis itself, but the explanation that came after it. The explanation of what was in the bottle, the explanation of when the formula had changed, the explanation of why, despite all of that, the product was still being sold. There is no surgery for Popper's maculopathy. There is no medication. There is no procedure that reverses the lesions once they have formed on the macula. There is only one treatment, and it is to stop, to put the bottle down and never pick it up again and wait, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, to find out how much of what was lost might eventually return. Some of it comes back. Not always. Not for everyone. Not for Daniel's left eye. What no one in that hospital knew yet, what Daniel himself did not know, and what would take another 1.5 years to fully surface, was that his case was not unusual. It was not even particularly severe by the standards that were quietly emerging. Across Europe, in ophthalmology departments that had no reason to be talking to each other, a pattern was assembling itself out of individual cases, individual folders, individual amber bottles. A doctor in London had 41 files. A researcher in Lyon had more. A clinic in Brussels had begun asking every young male patient with unexplained central vision loss a single new question. Do you use poppers? The answer, almost every time, was yes. And the product that caused it, the specific formulation, the particular chemical that had replaced the original ingredient after a regulatory change that most users had never heard of as was still on sale, that night, in shops, online, shipping in plain envelopes with customs declarations that said, room fragrance. The question that no one in that hospital corridor could answer, and the question that would take years, 2 countries, 1 determined doctor, and a trail of legal documents to even begin to address, was not whether the damage was real. The damage was real. It was sitting in 41 folders and in Daniel's left eye, and it was not going anywhere. The question was something else entirely. Who knew the formula had changed, and when did they know it? Daniel Reyes was born in Barcelona in 1991, the second of 3 children, in a flat 2 streets back from the sea, where the walls sweated in August and the neighbours argued through the ceiling every Sunday morning. His father was an electrician. His mother taught primary school. Neither of them had any particular opinion about art until Daniel started covering his school notebooks in detailed ink drawings at age 9, and by the time he was 14 those drawings had become something else, precise, controlled, architectural in a way that surprised his teachers and bewildered his father, who had expected the boy to follow him into trades. He didn't follow anyone into anything. He applied to a design program in Barcelona, got in, graduated with a portfolio that landed him a junior position at an agency before he'd technically finished his final semester. He was good at the work, not in the way that gets you famous, in the way that gets you trusted. Clients asked for him specifically. His senior colleagues noticed. By 23, he had a salary that surprised people when he mentioned it, and by 24, he had decided that Barcelona was finished for him, not because anything had gone wrong, but because London was where the agencies were that he actually wanted to work for. He packed 2 suitcases and moved in February 2015. The cold hit him immediately, a specific London cold that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the particular grey quality of the sky at 4 p.m. in winter. He rented a room in a flat in Elephant and Castle with 2 other people he'd found through a Spanish expat forum, and spent the first 3 months eating rice and working 14-hour days until a mid-size agency in Shoreditch offered him a full-time contract. London opened slowly for him, the way it opens for everyone who wasn't born there, reluctantly, in increments, through the right person, at the right party, at the right moment. That party happened in the spring of 2016. A colleague invited him to a gathering in a flat in Brixton, and through that flat he found his way into a loose social network of designers, musicians and people who worked in arts administration, and were funny about it. He found the gay scene the same way most people find it, through a friend who already knew where to go. Vauxhall on a Friday. Later on, Heaven, and occasionally the clubs in Dalston that didn't have a sign outside and required you to know the address in advance. He wasn't a heavy drinker. He danced. He stayed until the lights came up and then walked to the bus stop with his jacket under his arm even when it was cold, because the walk was part of it. This world, the specific world of South London gay nightlife in the late 2000s and 10s, had its own grammar, its own rules, its own vocabulary, its own unspoken calendar of which nights mattered and which were for tourists, and embedded in that grammar, as naturally as the music or the dress code or the specific brand of cheap tequila served at the bar near the back, was the bottle. Not a specific bottle. The bottle, the concept of it, the category. Small, amber, with a red or black cap. Passed between friends on the dance floor without ceremony, the way someone might offer a piece of gum. You unscrewed the cap, held it under one nostril, inhaled once, sharply, briefly, and then the blood vessels in your entire body dilated simultaneously in a wave that lasted between 10 and 30 seconds, and felt, to most people, like a sudden full-body warmth combined with a rush of lightheadedness, and, depending on the setting, an intensity of sensation that was difficult to describe without sounding like an exaggeration. It wasn't subtle. It also wasn't terrifying. That was the thing. The first time Daniel used poppers was at a house party in Camberwell in 2019. Someone passed the bottle during a particularly good song. 3 people used it. Someone laughed. The song kept playing. He felt the rush, warm, vertiginous, over in 20 seconds. And then it was gone and the party continued. No hangover the next morning. No residue. No craving. At least not in any form he recognized as craving. Just the memory of a sensation and the knowledge that the bottle would probably appear again at the next party and the one after that. He used it perhaps a dozen times over the following year, always socially, always in that specific context, a club, a party, a moment with friends when the music was good and the night felt like it had room for one more small intensity. He thought of it the way he thought of the occasional cigarette at a bar, something contextual, something that existed only inside a particular bracket of time and place and didn't follow him home. He was not wrong about that. Not yet. To understand what poppers actually are, and why they had been sitting inside that bracket of contextual, harmless communal for 5 decades, It helps to go back much further than Camberwell in 2019, further than Vauxhall, further than the entire history of gay nightlife as it currently exists. Amyl nitrite was first synthesized in 1844 by a French chemist named Antoine Jérôme Ballard, the same man who discovered the element bromine, though history generally finds bromine more interesting. The compound was identified as a vasodilator, meaning it relaxed the walls of blood vessels and caused them to widen rapidly, which increased blood flow and dropped blood pressure almost instantly. In 1867, a Scottish physician named Lauder Brunton discovered that inhaling amyl nitrite could abort an angina attack, the crushing chest pain caused by restricted blood flow to the heart, within seconds. It was genuinely life-saving in that context. Physicians began prescribing it in small glass capsules that patients could crush between their fingers and inhale. The capsules made a distinctive popping sound when broken, which is where the slang name came from. Poppers, a medical device, named after the sound it made. For nearly a century that was the entire story, a niche cardiac medication, used by a small population of patients, unremarkable to everyone else. The gay community did not discover poppers intentionally. It happened the way most subcultural adoptions happen, through accident and then enthusiasm. In the early 1970s in the United States, amyl nitrite was still available over the counter at pharmacies, and someone, no one knows exactly who, no single origin point has ever been identified, noticed that the rush it produced was useful in a sexual context. The vasodilatory effect relaxed smooth muscle tissue throughout the body, including muscle groups relevant to anal sex, making the act more comfortable and, for many users, significantly more pleasurable. The lightheadedness amplified sensation. The 10-second rush synchronized with music in a way that felt almost designed. Word spread with the speed that things spread in tight, socially connected communities. By the mid-1970s, small bottles of amyl nitrite were being sold in gay bars across New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles under brand names that had nothing to do with medicine. Rush, Ram, Hardware, Locker Room. The bottles were labelled as room deodorizers or liquid incense. This was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate legal structure, built from the very beginning to keep the product in a category that regulators didn't touch. The FDA tightened amyl nitrite regulations in 1969, requiring a prescription. The manufacturers responded by switching the active ingredient to isobutyl nitrite, chemically similar, same effect, not covered by the prescription requirement. Problem solved, product legal, sales continued. By 1978, poppers were a $40 million a year industry in the United States. That number is not a misprint. In the specific context of gay male culture, the product had achieved something that most consumer goods never do. It had become invisible through ubiquity. Nobody questioned it because everyone used it. The older generation of gay men who were alive during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s remember poppers as simply part of the environment. There, always, like the music and the darkness and the particular smell of certain clubs. A Canadian study published in 1988 found that over 70% of gay men surveyed had used poppers in the previous year. 70%. There were early health warnings. In the early 1980s, some researchers tentatively suggested a possible link between heavy poppers use and immune suppression, and for a time there was a theory, later thoroughly discredited, that poppers themselves might be contributing to AIDS. That theory collapsed under scrutiny, but it left something behind, a residue of official concern that never quite resolved into official action. The product had survived its first serious challenge, and it emerged from the 1980s with its reputation among users largely intact. Daniel knew some of this history. Not all of it, not in detail, but the broad shape of it. The idea that poppers were old, established, tested by decades of use, part of a culture that he was now genuinely, happily inside. When people in his social circle mentioned it, they mentioned it the way they mentioned vinyl records or certain bars that had been open since the 1980s, with a particular affection reserved for things that had survived long enough to become trustworthy. His flatmate at the time, a man named Carlo from Naples, who worked in fashion and had moved to London 4 years before Daniel, had been using poppers since he was 19. Carlo was 32 and healthy, and had never had a problem. He knew people who had been using them for 20 years. This was not a secret danger, not something whispered about in corners. It was a normal Friday. It was a hand reaching across in the dark with a small bottle and an expression that said, "The song just got better." Daniel took the bottle when it was offered and handed it back when he was done. That was the whole transaction. That was the entire weight of it, in 2019. What he didn't know, what Carlo didn't know, what almost everyone in that club and every other club in London didn't know, was that the bottle Carlo handed him was not the same bottle that had been passed around in those clubs for 50 years. It looked the same. It had a similar label. It produced a similar rush. But inside, the chemistry had shifted in a way that changed everything, and the change had happened more than a decade earlier, quietly, inside a regulatory process that most users had never heard of and would never think to check. The question of when Daniel first noticed something was different, not in the bottle, but in himself, has a specific answer. It was a Tuesday morning in March 2021, and he was trying to read an email on his laptop, and the third line of text looked like someone had pressed a thumb into the centre of the screen. March 2021. The clubs had been closed for 12 months. London under lockdown had a specific texture that is hard to describe to anyone who wasn't inside it. Not the silence, which people mention most often, but the stillness of the evenings, the way the city contracted after dark into something small and domestic and slightly airless. Daniel's flat in Elephant and Castle had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen where the window faced a brick wall, and a living room where the light was good until about 2 in the afternoon, and then wasn't. Carlo had gone back to Naples in October, when it became clear that the second lockdown would not be short. The spare room stayed empty. Daniel worked at the kitchen table because his bedroom felt too small, and he worked long hours because there was nothing else to do with the evenings. The agency had gone fully remote in March 2020 and had not gone back. The work itself hadn't changed. Same clients, same briefs, same deadlines, but the context around it had hollowed out. The rhythm of the office, the friction of other people, the lunch breaks that lasted 40 minutes instead of 20 because someone wanted to keep talking, all of it gone. What remained was the screen, the brief, the deadline, and after the deadline, nothing in particular. He started keeping a bottle in the flat sometime in the early summer of 2020. This requires a small explanation, because the distinction matters enormously. Using poppers in a club, in a crowd, with music at a volume that you feel in your chest, that is one thing. The setting is part of the pharmacology, in a sense. The context shapes the experience, limits it, gives it edges. You arrive, you use it, you go home. The bottle stays at the party. But a bottle kept in a flat, on a shelf next to the speaker, in a bedroom that has become the only social space available, that is a different object. It is available at any hour. The occasion for using it expands to fill whatever space the evening offers. Daniel ordered his first personal bottle from a website that loaded instantly, showed no age verification, and offered a choice of 11 different products at prices between £6 and £14. He chose one he recognised, a brand he'd seen passed around at parties, familiar label, same red cap. It arrived in 4 days. He used it the way he'd always used it, occasionally in the evenings, when the flat felt particularly static. Once a week, maybe twice. It was fine. It was the same rush, the same 20 seconds of warmth, the same nothing afterward. By October, it was 3 or 4 times a week. He didn't mark this change. There was no moment when he stood back and counted and felt concern. The escalation had the quality of most gradual things. It was invisible from the inside, obvious only in retrospect, and by the time anyone could have noticed it from the outside had been closed for months. In November, he placed a second order. This time, the website had a banner across the top promoting a new product. Stronger formula, same trusted brand, recommended for experienced users. The language was identical to the language used to sell hot sauce or coffee. The product was called something with XL in the name. He bought 2 bottles. This was the bottle that was different. Not visibly. Not in the label design. Not in the red cap. Not in the amber glass. The difference was invisible and chemical, and had been building in the background of the entire industry for 15 years, assembling itself through a sequence of regulatory decisions made in Brussels and London that Daniel had never heard of and had no reason to care about. The difference was the molecule. To understand the molecule, you need to understand a decision made by the European Union in 2007, a decision that had nothing to do with eye health and everything to do with a different concern entirely. The EU's Scientific Committee on Toxicity had been examining alkyl nitrites as a category and concluded that isobutyl nitrite, the specific compound that had been the dominant active ingredient in poppers since the 1970s, the one that had been used by millions of people across 5 decades, posed a carcinogenic risk with heavy, prolonged exposure. The concern was not with occasional users. It was with people who worked in industries where isobutyl nitrite was used as a solvent and were inhaling it occupationally for years. The response was a chemical ban under EU regulations. Isobutyl nitrite became illegal as a consumer product across all EU member states. Manufacturers did not stop making poppers. They switched ingredients. The alternative was isopropyl nitrite, a different alkyl nitrite compound, similar mechanism of action, similar subjective effect, legally distinct from the banned substance, and therefore sellable without any regulatory problem whatsoever. The switch happened across the industry. The labels changed slightly or not at all. The cap stayed red. The amber glass stayed amber. Nobody sent a letter to existing customers. Nobody posted an announcement online. The bottles that arrived in the post in 2008 and 2009 and every year after that contained a different chemical than the bottles that had arrived the year before, and the millions of people who bought them had no way of knowing. Here is what was known about isopropyl nitrite at the time of the switch. Not enough. Studies existed but were limited. No long-term safety data had been compiled in the way it would need to be compiled to make a confident claim about ocular toxicity, about what the compound does specifically to the retina when inhaled repeatedly over months or years. The absence of that data was not, for the manufacturers, a barrier. The substance was not banned. That was sufficient. What researchers would eventually establish, through the accumulating clinical evidence that started filtering into ophthalmology journals from around 2012 onward, was that isopropyl nitrite had a specific and damaging effect on the macula. The mechanism is not entirely understood even now, but the working theory involves the way alkyl nitrites affect the mitochondria in retinal cells, the small structures inside cells that generate energy, combined with the effect of nitric oxide on the retinal vasculature. The macula, which requires an extraordinary amount of metabolic activity to function, appears to be particularly vulnerable. Repeated exposure to isopropyl nitrite, at levels easily achieved by regular use of commercially available products, can cause the photoreceptor cells in the macula to degrade. Slowly, silently, without pain. The damage doesn't announce itself. There is no headache, no redness, no sensation of anything going wrong. The vision changes, a subtle distortion, a slight loss of contrast sensitivity, a faint blur in the center of the visual field that the brain initially compensates for automatically, filling in the gap with its best approximation of what should be there. Users don't notice for weeks, sometimes months. By the time the smear in the center of the vision becomes impossible to ignore, the underlying cells may already be gone. Daniel used the new bottle for the first time in November 2020. He felt the same rush, stronger, slightly, which matched what the website had promised. Nothing else felt different. He put the cap back on and set it on the shelf and went back to his screen. He used it 4 times that week. By January 2021, he had developed a habit that he would have struggled to name as a habit, because it had no dramatic shape. No craving that kept him up at night, no withdrawal, none of the signifiers that the popular imagination attaches to addiction. What it had was structure. Evenings without the bottle felt slightly flatter than the evenings with it. The 10-second rush had become a kind of punctuation in the long identical paragraphs of lockdown evenings, a small intensity inside a life that had otherwise reduced itself to a screen, a kitchen, a brick wall outside a window. He placed a 3rd order in February. 2 more XL bottles, same brand. The flat was quiet. Carlo's room had a line of dust on the windowsill that Daniel kept meaning to clean and kept not cleaning. The speaker in the living room played the same playlist it had been playing for 4 months. Outside, London continued to be still in the way it had learned to be still. In March, on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with a brief open on his laptop and a coffee that had gone cold, Daniel looked at the 3rd line of text in a client email and found that the middle of it was missing. Not blurred, exactly, not doubled. Missing. As if someone had pressed a thumb into the center of the screen and smeared the pixels sideways, leaving a small, persistent smudge in his line of sight that moved when he moved his eyes, because it wasn't on the screen at all. It was in his left eye. He blinked, rubbed his eye with the back of his hand, looked again. The smudge was still there. He moved the laptop slightly to the left and tried reading the email with only his right eye covered by his hand. Fine. Normal. The text was clear. He switched hands, covered his left eye, read with his right. Also clear. He uncovered both eyes. The smudge returned to the center of his left visual field, sitting there with the patient permanence of something that had been there for longer than he'd noticed. He finished reading the email. He replied. He refilled his coffee. He did not search for what might cause a visual disturbance in one eye, because the search would have returned results that he was not, on a Tuesday morning in March with 3 deadlines before Friday, prepared to engage with. The bottle on the shelf had about a 3rd left. He used it again that evening. What happened next in Daniel's flat over the following 6 weeks is its own story, and it runs parallel to a completely different story unfolding in a clinic 6 kilometers away, where a 34-year-old ophthalmologist named Dr. Priya Nair had just opened a patient file that was about to change the direction of her entire career, and she didn't know it yet. Dr. Priya Nair had wanted to be an ophthalmologist since she was 11 years old, which is an unusual thing to want at 11, and she had a precise reason for it. Her maternal grandmother had developed macular degeneration in her late 60s and had described the experience not as darkness, which is what most people expect blindness to feel like, but as absence. The center of everything she looked at simply stopped being there. Faces without features, pages without words. Her grandmother had pointed at Priya's face once and said, in Gujarati, that she could see the edges of her but not the middle. That sentence had lodged somewhere in Priya that nothing afterward dislodged. She trained at King's College London, did her ophthalmology residency at Moorfields Eye Hospital, the oldest eye hospital in the world, a fact she mentioned to patients who seemed nervous because the age of the institution appeared to comfort them in a way that statistics didn't, and joined a clinical practice in Suffolk in 2018. Her specialty within ophthalmology was medical retina, the diseases and damage that affect the retina specifically, as distinct from the structural problems of the eye, macular degeneration, diabetic retinopathy, retinal vascular occlusions, the conditions that steal central vision while leaving the periphery intact. Exactly the category of loss her grandmother had described, the one that had directed her entire career. She was thorough in the particular way that good diagnosticians are thorough, not slow, but complete. She did not skip steps. She kept meticulous records. Her patient files were organised with a precision that occasionally frustrated the administrative staff, who found her annotations excessive and occasionally delighted them, because when something needed to be found quickly, it was always findable. The patient file she opened in the spring of 2021 belonged to a 27-year-old man who had been referred by his GP with a complaint of central visual disturbance in his right eye. No trauma, no family history of retinal disease. The imaging showed a small but distinct lesion on the macula, a specific pattern of disruption to the photoreceptor layer that Priya had seen before, though not frequently, in cases of toxic maculopathy. Toxic maculopathy is the umbrella term for retinal damage caused by external substances rather than internal disease. Certain medications cause it. Hydroxychloroquine, used for lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, is the most well-known example. Certain solvents, certain exposures. She ran through her standard intake questions and reached the one about recreational substances. The patient mentioned poppers. She noted it, filed it, and moved on. 6 weeks later, a second patient. Different GP referral, different part of London, same pattern on the imaging, 29 years old, same lesion on the macula, same complaint, central distortion, right eye, no pain, no warning. She asked about poppers. He said yes, frequently. She noted it again. This time she pulled the first file and set them side by side on her desk. 2 cases was not a pattern. She knew that. 2 cases was a coincidence, or a referral cluster, or nothing at all. She filed them together in a new subfolder on her desktop, gave the subfolder a name that was purely administrative and revealed nothing about what she suspected, and returned to her normal caseload. The third patient arrived in July. To understand what Dr. Nair was looking at in that imaging, to understand why these 3 sets of scans, arranged on her screen in sequence, made her sit back in her chair and stay very still for a moment. It helps to know what a healthy macula looks like versus what she was seeing. The macula, in a healthy eye photographed with an OCT scanner, optical coherence tomography, a machine that uses light waves to take cross-sectional images of the retina in extraordinary detail, appears as a series of clean, distinct horizontal layers. Each layer corresponds to a specific type of cell. The outermost layer, farthest from incoming light, is the photoreceptor layer, the rods and cones that convert light into electrical signals. In a healthy young eye, that layer is uniform, dense, uninterrupted. In all 3 of her new patients, the photoreceptor layer at the centre of the macula showed the same disruption. A focal thinning, a small zone where the cells appeared to have pulled apart or compressed, leaving a gap in the architecture that the scanner rendered as a pale disruption in an otherwise dark horizontal band. The pattern was distinctive. It was not macular degeneration. The damage was too focal, too central, too symmetrical across patients who had nothing else in common. It was not diabetic. It was not vascular. It looked, specifically, like what you would expect to see if something toxic had been delivered repeatedly to the retinal cells at the fovea, the very centre of the macula, the point of highest visual acuity, the exact location responsible for reading, for recognizing faces, for the fine detail work that separates functional vision from impaired vision. She started researching. The literature on poppers and ocular toxicity was not non-existent. That was the first thing she found, and it surprised her. A paper published in the British Journal of Ophthalmology in 2010 had described a small case series of poppers-related maculopathy. A French group had published a follow-up in 2012. There were case reports scattered through the literature going back to 2006. The condition even had a name, Popper's maculopathy, which meant it was established enough to have been named, which meant it was established enough that someone, somewhere, should have been paying attention to it. Nobody in the mainstream was paying attention to it. The papers existed in the specific academic silence that affects research on stigmatized behaviors, published, indexed, available, and almost entirely unread outside the narrow specialty of medical retina. No public health campaign, no warning on the products, no GP guidance advising practitioners to ask about poppers when a young patient presented with unexplained central visual disturbance. The knowledge was there, sitting in journals, and the people who needed it most, the users, the GPs, the general practitioners who would be the first point of contact, had no access to it in any practical sense. Priya printed the 3 most relevant papers and read them at her kitchen table on a Sunday evening. Her coffee went cold. She read them twice. The papers described the same lesion pattern she was seeing. They described the same demographic, predominantly young gay men. They described cases in which vision partially recovered after cessation of use, and cases in which it did not. They mentioned isopropyl nitrite specifically, noting that the post-2007 reformulation appeared to be significantly more toxic to retinal tissue than the original isobutyl nitrite formulations. One paper, the French one from Lyon, included a line that she underlined twice. The authors noted that clinical presentations appeared to be increasing and suggested this might be related to the wider availability of high-concentration isopropyl nitrite products marketed online. That paper had been published in 2012, 9 years earlier. She went back to her clinic the following Monday and added a new question to her intake form. By the end of 2021, her subfolder contained 17 files. What the patients in those 17 files had in common, beyond the retinal imaging, was this. None of them had known. Not one had been warned by a GP, a pharmacist, a sexual health clinic, a harm reduction leaflet, a friend, a website, a product label, or any other source that the product they were using could damage their retina. Several of them had been using poppers for years, since before the formula change, and had experienced no problems with the original formulation, which made them confident that the product was safe. Some had switched to the stronger, higher concentration products during lockdown, exactly as Daniel had. One patient had been using a brand that was so highly concentrated it exceeded, according to one published analysis, the isopropyl nitrite content of anything available on the market before 2015. The market had not stood still. While the regulatory world had remained frozen, while the product continued to be sold as room odorizer, while no new safety assessments were commissioned, while the harm reduction community focused its attention on harder substances with more dramatic presentations, the industry had been quietly competing on potency. Stronger formulas sold better. Experienced users sought out the highest concentration they could find. New users trusted experienced users' recommendations. The feedback loop accelerated quietly, invisibly, inside a market that no regulator was monitoring and no public health body was tracking. The clubs were still closed when Priya submitted her first case series, 22 patients by then, to the British Journal of Ophthalmology in early 2022. The paper described the clinical presentation, the imaging findings, the chemical mechanism as currently understood, and the gap in public health information. It was factual and precise and took no political position. It recommended that clinicians ask about poppers use in young patients with unexplained maculopathy. It recommended that relevant health bodies consider issuing guidance. It was accepted for publication. It went through peer review. It was published in June 2022. The product remained on the shelves. There is a specific experience that researchers describe when their work enters the world and then nothing happens. The paper exists. It is indexed. It is available. And the situation it describes continues unchanged, because a journal publication and a policy change are not the same thing and have never been the same thing, and the distance between them is measured not in logic but in time, institutional inertia, and the question of who, specifically, is being harmed. Priya submitted the paper and went back to her clinic. New referrals were arriving. The clubs had reopened in the summer of 2021, cautiously at first, then fully, and with them had come a new wave of use, some of it by people who had developed heavy solitary habits during lockdown, and were now using the same high-concentration products in a social context as well. Her patient intake continued. The 17th file had contained a detail she kept returning to, not because it was medically unusual, but because of one specific piece of information the patient had mentioned almost in passing, as context. He had said that he had recommended the same brand he was using to at least 8 friends. He had recommended it because it was strong, because experienced users liked it, because within the community he moved in it had developed a reputation as the best product currently available. 8 friends. She had no way of knowing how many of those 8 were already sitting in someone else's waiting room, or would be. She had no way of contacting them. The patient himself hadn't thought to warn them, because when he came to her clinic he still didn't fully understand what had happened in his own eyes, let alone what might be happening in theirs. This was the architecture of the problem, not a single chain of cause and effect that could be interrupted at one point, but a distributed invisible network of exposure, recommendation, and harm, operating entirely within a legal framework, powered by a market that rewarded potency, in a community that had been told for 50 years that this particular product was one of the safer things in their world. Somewhere in that network, on a street in Manchester, a 26-year-old man named Tomasz Wiśniewski had just opened the 3rd bottle of the same brand in 4 months. He was fine. That was what he would tell you, if you asked him in November 2021. Completely fine. He'd been using poppers since he moved to England at 22, never had a problem, loved the stuff, couldn't imagine a Saturday night without it. His vision was perfect. He'd had an eye test the previous year, routine, at the optician on the high street near his flat, and been told his eyes were excellent. He was fine. He used the bottle that evening, and the evening after, and by the following Saturday he was in a club in the Northern Quarter with his friends, and the music was good and the night had that quality of expansion that good nights have, and he passed the bottle left and he passed it right, and nobody thought anything of it at all. 6 weeks later he woke up and the ceiling above his bed had a hole in it. Not a real hole, a visual one. A gap where the central field of his right eye had, overnight or over the previous weeks without him registering it, simply stopped reporting. The smudge in Daniel's left eye stayed for 2 weeks before he mentioned it to anyone. He mentioned it to Carlo over a video call. Carlo, back in Naples, who was tanned in the way that people who have returned to Mediterranean climates become tanned, the kind of colour that makes people in London feel the specific resentment of the seasonally deprived. Daniel described it as a visual glitch, a pixel problem, something his eye was doing that it would probably stop doing on its own, the way a muscle twitch eventually stops. Carlo told him to drink more water and sleep more, which was Carlo's answer to most physical complaints, and Daniel nodded and changed the subject. He Googled it that night. This was a mistake in the specific way that Googling visual symptoms at 11 p.m. is always a mistake. The results were comprehensive, alarming, and completely unable to tell him which of the 17 possible causes applied to his left eye specifically. He found references to retinal detachment, which frightened him. He found references to ocular migraines, which seemed more plausible. He found a Reddit thread where someone described almost identical symptoms and was told by several commenters that it was probably a floater, nothing serious, happened to everyone eventually. He found no results connecting the symptom to Popper's. He searched specifically Popper's vision, Popper's eye problems, and found a handful of forum posts, most of them old, most of them reassuring. The consensus in those threads, assembled over years by users talking to other users, was that Popper's could cause brief visual disturbances during use. The rush itself sometimes produced a momentary blurring or light sensitivity, but that these resolved within minutes and caused no lasting damage. The threads were confident. They cited longevity, decades of use, millions of users, no epidemic of blindness. The logic was airtight from the inside. The logic was built on the old formula. Daniel read the reassuring threads and felt reassured. He was a graphic designer with 2 decades of screen time behind him. Eye strain was plausible. Dehydration was plausible. He'd been working 12-hour days for months in a flat with inadequate natural light, eating irregular meals, sleeping poorly. Any of these could explain a visual disturbance. The one explanation he didn't seriously consider was the bottle on the shelf, partly because he'd been using it for months without incident, and partly because everything he'd read told him there was no incident to have. He made an appointment with his GP for 3 weeks out, the earliest available slot, and continued working. The smudge didn't grow. It didn't shrink either. It sat in the centre of his left visual field with the unvarying patience of something structural, something that belonged, something that had decided it lived there now. He adapted to it in the way the brain is extraordinarily good at adapting to fixed visual disturbances, by routing around it, filling the gap automatically, using his right eye's input to complete the picture. For most tasks, most of the day, it was ignorable. It was only when he covered his right eye, or when he was doing work that required extreme precision with his left eye's input specifically, that the absence became fully visible and fully strange. He used the bottle 4 nights that week. He didn't connect these two facts. Across the city, in her clinic in Southwark, Dr. Priya Nair was about to experience the specific frustration of being right too early. She had submitted an abstract to a medical conference, a regional ophthalmology meeting scheduled for February 2022, proposing a presentation on her emerging case series. The abstract outlined the clinical pattern, the chemical mechanism, and the gap in public awareness. It was accepted for a 15-minute slot in a session on toxic retinopathies. She prepared her slides with the same precision she applied to her patient files, organising the OCT images in sequence, building the epidemiological argument from individual cases upward to pattern, designing the final slide as a call for formal clinical guidance. She presented it on a Thursday morning to a room of approximately 60 ophthalmologists, most of whom were also presenting that day and were mentally halfway into their own slides. She spoke for 14 minutes. She showed the images. She made the argument. The first question from the floor was whether she had controlled for other toxic exposures. She had, as much as the case series format allowed. The second question was whether the sample size was sufficient to draw conclusions. She acknowledged it was preliminary. The third comment, not a question, a comment, came from a senior consultant near the back of the room, a man with the particular authority that comes from 20 years in a specialty, and the particular confidence that comes from 20 years of being listened to. He said that alkyl nitrites had been in widespread use for 50 years, that the literature on their ocular effects was inconclusive, and that presenting a case series of this size as evidence of a systemic problem was, in his view, premature. Polite disagreement, civilized skepticism, the normal friction of evidence working its way through institutions. Priya thanked him for his comment, answered 2 more questions from colleagues who seemed genuinely interested, and packed up her laptop. In the corridor afterward, one of those genuinely interested colleagues, a retinal specialist from Edinburgh, told her he had seen 3 similar cases in the past year and hadn't known what to make of them. He asked her to send him the paper when it was published. She sent it to him 8 months later, in June 2022. He wrote back the same day. He had 7 cases by then. 7 in Edinburgh alone. Daniel's GP appointment happened in April 2021. The GP examined his eyes with a standard ophthalmoscope, found nothing obviously abnormal at the resolution that instrument allows, noted the complaint, and referred him to the ophthalmology outpatient service at his local NHS trust. The waiting time for a non-urgent outpatient ophthalmology appointment was, at that point in the pandemic recovery period, approximately 14 weeks. 14 weeks. The smudge had been there for 6. He went home and worked. The bottle on the shelf had been replaced. He'd ordered a fresh one in March, same brand, same XL formulation, because the previous bottle was empty. There is a particular quality to the period in Daniel's story between the April GP appointment and the July ophthalmology appointment. 3 months of continuation, of carrying on, of a problem acknowledged and then effectively suspended. He knew something was wrong. He had taken the first step of telling a doctor. The machine was in motion, and so the urgency dissipated slightly, replaced by a waiting room patience that felt reasonable, given that the symptom was stable, that he was functional, that the work was still getting done, that the smudge was there but not growing. He told himself, and he was not wrong in the narrow sense, that there was nothing more he could do until the appointment. The bottle disagreed. By May, his use had reached a frequency he would later, in the reconstruction of events, find difficult to be precise about. Not because he was hiding it. He had no reason to hide it from himself, but because it had become ambient. The bottle was in the flat the way coffee was in the flat, the way the speaker was in the flat. It was part of the furniture of evenings. The specific occasion for using it had expanded and then dissolved, leaving behind something that required no occasion at all. His right eye was fine. He would cover his left eye sometimes just to check, and the right was consistently clear. The problem was contained. One eye, one small area, no progression he could detect. He was wrong about the progression. The damage in his left eye was not static. It was slow, and his brain was compensating so efficiently that the worsening was invisible to him, but the OCT imaging that would eventually be taken would show, with the precision of light wave cross-sections, that the photoreceptor layer at his fovea had been thinning steadily for months. The compensation mechanism that makes the brain such a remarkable adaptive organ was, in this instance, actively concealing the damage from the person it was trying to help. In June, he noticed the first disturbance in his right eye, not the same as the left, smaller, less defined, more like a momentary shimmer than a smudge. It appeared when he was tired, or so he told himself, because that was when he first noticed it, at the end of a long day, looking at his monitor in the dimming evening light. He blinked it away. It came back. He closed his right eye for a second, opened it. The shimmer was there for a moment, and then it wasn't. He did not call the GP. He had the ophthalmology appointment in 6 weeks. The online forums had a thread that summer, started by a user in Amsterdam, asking whether anyone else had experienced persistent visual disturbances after poppers use. The thread had 37 replies. The majority were reassuring. Temporary effects, probably other factors, happens to some people, goes away. Several users recommended switching brands. One user mentioned that they'd read something about eye damage in a medical journal, but the response to that comment was skeptical. Someone pointed out that medical journals write alarming things about all kinds of substances, and that 50 years of widespread use spoke louder than one paper. The original poster replied that the disturbances had been going on for 3 months. The thread went quiet after that. Tomasz Wiśniewski found that thread in December 2021, 2 weeks after waking up to the hole in his ceiling. He read it on his phone in his flat in Manchester, lying on his back in the dark, one hand covering his left eye so he could see the screen clearly with his right. He scrolled through all 37 replies. He read the skeptical responses. He found the mention of the medical journal. He searched for the paper and found a reference to it behind a paywall that he didn't have access to. He put his phone down and lay in the dark for a while. Tomasz had moved to Manchester from Krakow at 22 for reasons that were practical and emotional in roughly equal measure. A job offer from a logistics company, a relationship that had ended badly, and a general sense that Poland in 2017 had become a country that required too much of him simply to exist in it comfortably. He had found Manchester welcoming in the specific way that British cities can be welcoming to people who work hard and ask for little. He had a flat, a job he'd been promoted in twice, a group of friends he trusted, and a social life anchored by the Canal Street bars and the clubs nearby that stayed open until 4 on weekends. He was 26 years old. He had worked in logistics. His eyesight until 6 weeks ago had been the last thing he thought about. He made an appointment with an optician the following morning. The optician looked at his retina, went quiet in the way that people go quiet when they see something unexpected, and referred him to Manchester Royal Eye Hospital with a note marked urgent. The appointment was in 3 days. In those 3 days, Tomasz did not stop using the bottle. Not out of denial exactly, but out of a specific logic that is comprehensible from the inside even if it appears irrational from the outside. The damage, if there was damage, had already happened, and stopping now wouldn't undo it, and the appointment was in 3 days, and the evenings were long and the flat was quiet. The bottle was on the kitchen counter. He used it on the first evening and the second evening, and on the morning of the third day he took the bus to the Manchester Royal Eye Hospital and sat in the waiting room with his jacket on his lap and his phone in his hand, not looking at the screen, watching the wall instead, which was easier. In London, Daniel's July ophthalmology appointment was now 2 weeks away. The shimmer in his right eye had appeared 3 more times. Each time it faded. Each time he noted it and continued. The new bottle he'd ordered in June was already half empty. What neither Daniel nor Tomasz knew, what almost every person using these products in the summer of 2021 did not know, was that the specific brand they had both independently selected, the one with the XL in its name, had been the subject of a chemical analysis conducted by a harm reduction researcher in Belgium, who had found its isopropyl nitrite concentration to be more than twice the level found in standard formulations from 5 years earlier. That analysis existed. It had been shared in a small harm reduction network. It had not reached the forums, the clubs, the websites that sold the product, or the product itself. The website was still running its promotional banner, new stock, bestseller, recommended for experienced users. The orders kept coming in. The supply chain for poppers in 2021 was not complicated. It was not a black market. It had no middlemen operating in shadows, no coded language, no risk of arrest. It was an ordinary e-commerce supply chain, optimized for search engine visibility and repeat purchases, with warehouses in the Netherlands and the UK, and a logistics infrastructure that could move a product from a shelf in Rotterdam to a letterbox in Manchester in 72 hours. The websites that sold the products looked like websites that sold vitamins. customer reviews, star ratings, a FAQ section, a discreet packaging guarantee. The manufacturers themselves were small companies, most of them based in the Netherlands, France, or the United Kingdom, operating under company registrations that listed their products as chemical solvents or aromatic compounds. Some had been in business since the 1980s, surviving the various regulatory pressures of 4 decades through the same mechanism they had always used: reclassification. When one label became legally problematic, they found another: room deodorizer, leather cleaner, aromatizer. The product inside the bottle remained essentially the same through these transformations, only the official description changed. What changed in the years after 2007 was not the packaging or the marketing or the company structures. What changed was the molecule. Priya Nair had been trying to trace that change with the tools available to a clinical researcher: published literature, patient histories, the chemical analyses that occasionally surfaced in harm reduction networks. And what she found, assembled piece by piece over the course of 2022, was a picture that had a clear shape but a frustratingly blurred centre. She could see the before and the after. She could document the clinical consequence. What she could not pin down, because the manufacturing process was proprietary and no regulatory body had compelled disclosure, was the precise moment at which individual companies had made the switch, and crucially what internal documentation existed around that decision. She could see the wound. She couldn't see the decision to inflict it. The French research group she'd been corresponding with since early 2022, based at a university hospital in Lyon, led by a retinal specialist named Dr. Etienne Marchand, had been working the same problem from a different angle. Where Priya had built her case from clinical data upward, Marchand's team had been analysing the chemistry downward, purchasing products commercially, testing them in the laboratory, measuring isopropyl nitrite concentrations and comparing them to published safety thresholds for nitrite compounds. What they found across a sample of 14 commercially available products was a range of concentrations so wide it suggested the market had no coherent quality standard whatsoever. The weakest product in their sample contained isopropyl nitrite at a concentration roughly equivalent to the older isobutyl nitrite formulations. The strongest contained a concentration nearly 3 times higher. Both were sold legally. Both were labelled not for human consumption. Both were reviewed positively by customers on the same retail platforms. The strongest product in Marchand's sample was the one with XL in its name. Priya received Marchand's preliminary data in a shared document on a Tuesday evening in September 2022. She read it at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd read the 3 research papers 18 months earlier, and this time her coffee didn't go cold because she read it in 8 minutes, and then immediately began drafting an email to a colleague at the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, the UK body responsible for assessing the safety of medical and consumer chemical products. She had written to the MHRA once before, 6 months earlier, after her paper was published, flagging the clinical findings and requesting information about any ongoing safety assessment of isopropyl nitrite products. The MHRA had responded with a letter that was courteous, institutional, and precisely calibrated to acknowledge concern without committing to action. They were aware of the published literature. They were monitoring the situation. They would take appropriate steps if the evidence warranted intervention. The letter was signed by someone whose title suggested mid-level responsibility, and whose response suggested the matter had not yet reached anyone with the authority to act on it. She wrote again in September. This time she attached Marchand's data alongside her own published paper, and a 1-page summary she wrote specifically to be readable by a non-specialist in under 5 minutes. She had learned, by this point, that the transmission of clinical concern into regulatory action required not just evidence, but a translation of evidence into language that moved through institutions, The OCT images that were self-evidently alarming to any ophthalmologist meant nothing to a policy official who had never held a retinal scanner. The one-page summary was a translation. She sent the email and went to bed. The MHRA responded 3 weeks later with another courteous letter. It referenced the ongoing evidence review. It noted that the products in question were not licensed for human use, which meant they fell into a regulatory grey zone. The MHRA's remit covered medicines and medical devices, and a product sold as a room odorizer occupied an ambiguous position with respect to that remit. The letter suggested she might also contact the Health and Safety Executive, which had a broader mandate over chemical safety in consumer products. She sat with that letter for a long time, the regulatory grey zone. That phrase. It was doing the same work as the not for human consumption label on the bottle, creating a gap between what the product was and what it was officially permitted to be, a gap wide enough that the harm could fall through it without landing on anyone's desk with sufficient weight to compel action. The product was not a medicine, therefore the MHRA's remit was limited. The product was not consumed, officially, therefore food safety regulations didn't apply. It was sold as a room odorizer, therefore trading standards would apply. But trading standards enforcement was a local authority function, fragmented across hundreds of councils, none of which had a specific mandate to test aromatic products for ocular toxicity. The Health and Safety Executive concerned itself primarily with workplace chemical exposure. The product sat in the gap between all of them, visible to none. This was not an accident. The gap had been there since the 1970s, since the first manufacturer had printed room deodorizer on the first bottle of amyl nitrite, and thereby moved the product out of the FDA's field of view. The gap had been maintained through every reformulation, every new brand, every change in ownership and distribution. It was, in a practical sense, the product's most valuable feature. In Manchester, Tomasz Wiśniewski had his appointment at the Royal Eye Hospital in January 2022, 7 weeks after the ceiling hole had first appeared. The appointment had been delayed. His original urgent referral had been received, but the scheduling system had processed it as routine. A clerical error that would later be the subject of an internal complaint that resolved nothing. 7 weeks. During those 7 weeks, the hole in his right eye had widened. He had not used the bottle every night, but he had used it most nights, because stopping felt like an admission that the bottle was the cause, and he was not yet ready to make that admission. He was ready to make it at the eye hospital, when the imaging came back. The ophthalmologist who saw Tomasz that day was a registrar, a doctor in specialist training, experienced but not yet fully qualified, who recognised the OCT pattern immediately because she'd attended a seminar 2 months earlier, at which a senior colleague had discussed Priya Nayar's published paper. She asked Tomasz about poppers. He confirmed it. She photographed both retinas and found what she was looking for in both. The right eye significantly more advanced, the left showing early changes that had not yet produced symptoms. Both eyes. Tomasz had not noticed anything wrong with his left eye, because the damage there was still in the range the brain compensates for. If he'd continued using the product for another 3 months without stopping, the left eye would have progressed to symptomatic damage. The registrar explained this carefully, using a diagram she drew on a prescription pad, a rough sketch of the layers of the retina, the location of the macula, the specific zone of damage visible on his scan. Tomasz looked at the diagram. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. He stopped using poppers that day. He carried the folded diagram in his jacket for 6 months. He moved it from jacket to jacket without consciously deciding to keep it. It was still in the pocket of his winter coat when he eventually saw a specialist for a follow-up assessment. In London, Daniel's July 2021 ophthalmology appointment had happened, and it had produced findings that the attending registrar had described as concerning but not immediately urgent. The left eye showed early maculopathy, The right showed nothing definitive on standard imaging. The appointment had resulted in a further referral to a medical retina specialist, which carried a waiting time of 16 weeks. 16 weeks. He went home from that July appointment with a printout he didn't fully understand and a follow-up date in November, and no specific instruction to stop using the product that was causing the damage, because the attending registrar, young, recently trained, working through a list of 30 patients that afternoon, had not asked about poppers. It was not on the standard intake form for that clinic at that time. Priya Nair's paper would not be published for another 11 months. The bottle at home was 3/4 full. He used it that evening because the appointment had been stressful, and because the shimmer in his right eye had not appeared that day, and because the left eye problem was being handled, was in the system, was moving through the correct channels at the speed those channels moved. He used it and felt the familiar rush and went to sleep. In September 2021, he noticed the shimmer in his right eye every day. October. The shimmer had become a smear, smaller than the left but fixed. Present in the morning, present at noon, present when he was trying to work on a brief that required precise colour differentiation between shades so close together they were distinguished only at the centre of the visual field, exactly the region now compromised in both eyes. He emailed his project manager at the agency and said he was having some health issues and might need to adjust his workload temporarily. He didn't specify. The project manager replied with concern and flexibility and said to take the time he needed. Daniel stared at that reply for a while, because it was kind and because he hadn't expected it to be kind, and because it made the situation more real in a way that the ophthalmology appointments had not quite managed. November came. The medical retina appointment. The specialist, a consultant with a face that gave nothing away while she worked, examined both eyes with an OCT scanner and sat back and looked at the screen for a long time before she turned to Daniel and began speaking. He would describe that moment later, the specific quality of the pause before she spoke, as the moment he understood that he'd been ignoring something that had not been ignoring him. The left eye, moderate macular damage, central photoreceptor layer disrupted across an area significantly larger than the July imaging had suggested. The right eye, early but definitive maculopathy, consistent with toxic exposure, progressing. Both eyes, actively progressing. The July imaging had shown the beginning. The November imaging showed the trajectory. The consultant asked about poppers. It was a new question on the intake form at that clinic, added in September 2021, following a clinical memo circulated after a senior colleague had read Priya Nair's conference abstract. 3 months earlier, and Daniel would not have been asked. The timing, in this particular case, is worth sitting with. He told her yes. She asked about frequency, duration, the specific brand. He told her everything. She typed without breaking eye contact with the screen. He watched her type. She told him to stop immediately. That day. She told him that with cessation some recovery was possible. Partial, not guaranteed, dependent on how much of the photoreceptor layer remained viable. She told him that continued use would accelerate the damage toward a threshold from which no meaningful recovery was possible. She gave him a date for the next appointment, January 2022, and a leaflet about Popper's maculopathy that the clinic had printed from an online resource that had been put together by a small harm reduction charity with a budget of approximately £3,000. He went home and put the bottle in the kitchen bin. Then he stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the bin, and then he took the bottle back out and put it on the shelf, not to use it. He left it there for 3 days without using it, which was its own kind of statement, though he couldn't have said what the statement was. On the 3rd day he put it back in the bin and this time left it there. The right eye continued to deteriorate through December. In January 2022, the scan showed further progression in both eyes, despite 6 weeks of cessation. The consultant explained that the damage already done continued to declare itself in imaging for weeks after stopping, as the affected cells completed their degradation process. Stopping use ended the cause, but not immediately the consequence. Daniel looked at the scan on the screen. The pale disruption at the centre of each eye's imaging was larger than November. He was a graphic designer. He understood what he was looking at. The question nobody could yet answer, not the consultant, not Priya Nair, not Marchand's team in Lyon, not any of the researchers now corresponding across 3 countries, was whether the companies that had manufactured and marketed the strongest formulations had ever internally assessed the ocular risk of their products. Whether anyone in any office in any warehouse in Rotterdam or a business park outside Lyon, or a light industrial unit in the English Midlands, had ever looked at the chemistry of what was in the bottle and asked the question that should have been asked the moment the formula changed. Whether the answer to that question was no or yes, or something more complicated than either. That was what Priya Nair was about to find out, and it was going to reframe everything. The document that changed Priya Nair's understanding of the entire situation was not a scientific paper. It was not a regulatory filing or a clinical report. It was a product safety assessment, an internal company document, 12 pages long, dated 2009, written in Dutch and later translated, that had been submitted to a Dutch chemical safety database as part of a routine compliance procedure under EU regulations governing hazardous substances in the workplace. It was publicly accessible, had been for 13 years, sitting in a database that required no login, no credentials, no freedom of information request. Available to anyone who knew where to look and what search terms to use and could read Dutch, or had access to translation software, and happened to be looking for internal chemical assessments of isopropyl nitrite compounds filed by manufacturers of aromatic products in the Netherlands between 2007 and 2012. Priya found it in March 2023, 18 months into her correspondence with Marchand's team in Lyon, after a French regulatory researcher in their network, a woman who had spent 15 years working in EU chemical compliance before moving into academia, suggested that mandatory workplace safety filings might contain formulation data that voluntary product disclosures would never provide. She downloaded the document on a Wednesday afternoon. She ran it through a translation tool. She read it twice. Then she called Marchand. The document was a REACH assessment, REACH being the EU regulatory framework for the registration, evaluation, authorization and restriction of chemicals, which required manufacturers to file safety data for chemical compounds used in their products, primarily to protect workers who handled those compounds in industrial settings. The filing had been submitted by a Dutch manufacturer, a company whose name appeared on several of the most widely distributed poppers brands in Europe, and it assessed the safety profile of isopropyl nitrite as an ingredient in their aromatic product line. The assessment covered inhalation toxicity, it covered skin exposure, it covered environmental impact, and on page 7, in a section on systemic effects, it contained a paragraph that assessed the potential ocular toxicity of isopropyl nitrite based on the available literature at the time of filing. The available literature at the time of filing, 2009, included 2 published case reports and 1 animal study. The case reports described retinal toxicity in humans following inhalation exposure. The animal study showed dose-dependent retinal damage in rats at concentrations achievable by standard product use. The assessment acknowledged this data. It noted the potential for ocular toxicity. It classified the risk as requiring further investigation. Further investigation. The product went on sale. Priya sat with that paragraph for a long time. The manufacturer had filed a document in 2009, acknowledging that their own product might cause the exact category of eye damage she'd been documenting since 2021. The filing was a legal compliance document submitted to a regulatory database, and then the product had been released into the market with a not-for-human consumption label, and a recommendation from the website that it was best suited to experienced users. The not-for-human consumption label was now visible in a completely different light. It was not a safety warning. It was not information for the consumer. It was a legal instrument, a 4-word phrase that, in the event of any future claim of harm, would allow the manufacturer to argue that the product had been misused, that the user had deviated from the intended purpose, that the company bore no responsibility for what happened to the person who had inhaled a chemical the company had internally flagged as a potential ocular toxin 2 years before they sold it to them. This was twist number 2, and it reframed everything from the beginning. 50 years of "it's been around forever, it's safe." That history belonged to the old formula, the one the EU had banned. The new formula, the one in every bottle sold in Europe after 2007, had been internally assessed by at least one major manufacturer as potentially toxic to the eye before it reached the market. The users who trusted those 50 years of history were trusting a safety record that belonged to a different chemical. The experienced user recommendation on the website was, in this context, not a lifestyle designation. It was a redirection of liability. If you were experienced, you had chosen the stronger product knowingly. You were an expert consumer making an informed decision. The company had told you it was for rooms, not people. Whatever happened next was yours. Marchand's team in Lyon, when they absorbed the implications of the Reach document, began searching for similar filings by other manufacturers. They found 3 more over the following 2 months, all filed between 2008 and 2013, all covering isopropyl nitrite, all containing some acknowledgement of potential ocular or systemic toxicity, all followed by the continued uninterrupted sale of products containing that compound. 4 companies, 4 internal safety assessments, 4 acknowledgements of risk, 0 product recalls, 0 warning labels, 0 communication to users. The clubs, during all of this, had been open for 2 years. By mid-2023, the bottles were everywhere again, in the bars in Vauxhall, on the shelves of the sex shops on Old Compton Street, in the bedrooms of men who had been isolated for a year and were now released back into a social world they had missed acutely, using more than they had before lockdown. The market had not corrected. If anything, the high-concentration products had consolidated their market position during the lockdown period. Online sales had normalized them. The experienced user framing had given them status, and the returning clubbers who had developed heavier solitary habits brought those habits back into the social context. The damage being done was invisible by design. No broken bones, no blood work anomalies, no symptoms that appeared in a GP's standard checkup. Only a specific pattern on a specific scan, visible only to a specialist who knew what to look for, readable only if someone had thought to ask the right question at intake. Most clinics still hadn't updated their forms. Most GPs still didn't know to ask. Priya's patient count in 2023 crossed 90. She was now collaborating formally with Marchand's group, with the Edinburgh retinal specialist, and with a researcher at Ghent University who'd been building a Belgian case series. Together, their patient data spanned 4 countries, covered a period from 2018 to the present, and showed a clear temporal correlation with the availability of high-concentration isopropyl nitrite products online. They were preparing a multi-centre study, the kind of study with the kind of sample size that moved through institutions rather than bouncing off them. The paper was being written, but the paper would take time, peer review, revisions, publication, institutional response. The paper existed in the future and the products existed now, and the gap between those two timelines was measured in bottles sold and appointments not yet made, and people going home from clubs in cities across Europe with an amber bottle in their pocket and no reason, based on anything available to them, to be afraid of it. Daniel Reyes, in the spring of 2023, was not using the product. He had not used it since November 2021, 16 months. His right eye had shown partial recovery in the imaging from 6 months post-cessation. Some photoreceptor activity had returned in the peripheral zone of the macular lesion, enough to reduce the visual distortion slightly, enough for the brain's compensation to work more efficiently. His left eye had not changed. The damage at the fovea, the very centre, the point of maximum acuity, was stable, which in this context meant permanently degraded. He had left the agency in February 2022, not been asked to leave, chosen to. The work had become untenable in specific practical ways that he catalogued to himself with the precision of a designer who understood exactly what his tools required: colour differentiation at close range, reading fine print in client briefs, the pixel-level decisions that defined good graphic design at a professional level. His right eye compensated for some of it. The compensation was not enough. He had taken a job at a design college as a teaching assistant, a role he was qualified for, one that used his knowledge differently, one that required him to see the broad shape of student work rather than its finest resolution. The salary was lower. The flat in Elephant and Castle was now his alone. He could no longer afford a flatmate he didn't need, so he now needed one. A new flatmate arrived in March, a 23-year-old music student from Cork named Siobhan, who left toast crumbs on the counter and played the same 4 bars of something complicated on a keyboard late at night, and never seemed to notice that Daniel didn't go out on weekends the way he used to. He had told no one at the college about his vision. The teaching role didn't require disclosure. He managed. Tomasz Wisniewski's recovery had followed a different curve. His right eye, the more severely damaged one, had shown minimal improvement at 12 months post-cessation. His left eye, caught earlier, had recovered more substantially. He was left with an asymmetry that was manageable in practical terms but permanent in fact. His right eye would never regain the central acuity it had lost. He had returned to his logistics job after 3 months on sick leave. His employer had been understanding in the way that medium-sized companies are understanding when the alternative involves a legal conversation. He was back at his desk reading from a screen with his left eye doing most of the work, his right contributing the peripheral context. He had not been back to Canal Street. Not because he was afraid of poppers specifically. He had stopped. The stopping was complete. That part was resolved. He had not been back because the street, and the clubs, and the specific architecture of those evenings existed for him now, inside the same bracket of time and circumstance as the bottle, and the bracket was closed. He missed it in the particular way you miss something that you cannot disentangle from the thing that harmed you. Priya knew about Daniel's case because he had eventually been transferred to her clinic, the specialist network being small enough in London that a complex macular case in a young man with a popper's history reliably found its way to her. She knew about Tomasz because the Edinburgh colleague had forwarded his case notes as part of their collaboration. She had their files. She had 89 other files. She had the REACH documents. She had Marchand's concentration data. She had, by the summer of 2023, everything she needed to make the argument she had been trying to make for 2 years. What she was about to discover was that the argument had an entirely different dimension, one that none of the clinical data had prepared her for, one that didn't live in ophthalmology journals or regulatory databases, but in a conversation she had in July 2023 with a man who had worked in the poppers manufacturing industry for 11 years before leaving it, and who had contacted her through a harm reduction charity after reading a newspaper article about her work. He had something to tell her. He wanted to do it in person. His name was Gerard Foss. He was 44 years old, originally from Utrecht, and he had spent 11 years working in product development and quality control for a company that manufactured aromatic compounds, a category that included, as its most profitable line, several of the most widely distributed poppers brands in Western Europe. He had left the company in 2019, 4 years before he contacted Priya, under circumstances he described in his initial message to the harm reduction charity as complicated. He was not a whistleblower in the legal sense. He had signed nothing that prevented him from speaking. He had simply left, taken a job in an unrelated industry, agricultural supply based in Leiden, and spent 4 years not talking about what he knew. The newspaper article about Priya's work had been published in a British broadsheet in May 2023, picked up by a Dutch news aggregator, and read by Gerard Voss on a Sunday morning on his phone, while his daughter watched television in the next room. He read it twice. He sat with it for 6 weeks before he wrote the email. They met in London in July, in a cafe near Waterloo Station that Priya had chosen because it was close to her clinic and loud enough that a conversation would not carry to neighbouring tables. Gerard arrived 7 minutes early. He was a broad-shouldered man with the slightly formal bearing of someone who had rehearsed the conversation extensively in their head and was now managing the gap between the rehearsed version and the real one. He had brought a shoulder bag. He kept it on his lap throughout. What he told her took 2 hours. The company he had worked for had been manufacturing isopropyl nitrite products since 2008, the year after the EU ban on isobutyl nitrite. The switch had been rapid and deliberate, managed by the company's chemistry team with the speed of a business responding to a regulatory change, rather than the caution of an organisation reassessing a product's safety profile from the ground up. The primary objective had been continuity of supply. The secondary objective had been competitive positioning, because if isobutyl nitrite was now banned across the EU, every manufacturer was in the same position simultaneously, and the first company to produce a stable, high-quality isopropyl nitrite alternative at competitive cost would capture significant market share. They moved fast. So did the others. What Gerard knew, and what made his account different from anything Priya had found in the published literature or the REACH databases, was what had happened internally when the company's chemistry team began noticing anomalies in their own product testing. Not ocular testing. The company did no ocular testing on its products, a fact that Gerard stated without inflection, and that Priya noted without comment. The anomalies were in stability testing, the routine process of checking whether a chemical compound maintained consistent properties over its shelf life under various temperature and storage conditions. Isopropyl nitrite, the team found, was significantly less stable than isobutyl nitrite. It degraded faster. In warm conditions, a warehouse in summer, a car glove compartment, a jacket pocket in a crowded club, the degradation accelerated, and the degradation products, the compounds that isopropyl nitrite broke down into as it aged, included substances with a toxicity profile more aggressive than the original compound. The older the product, the hotter its storage history, the more degraded the formulation, and the more toxic the resulting chemical mixture. This was not the kind of information that appeared in any REACH filing Priya had found. Gerard had been present at the internal meeting where this stability data was discussed. He remembered the room, a conference room on the second floor of the company's facility outside Rotterdam, white walls, a whiteboard with chemical diagrams that someone had half erased, a window that faced a car park. He remembered the senior manager's response to the stability data. The manager had noted the finding, asked whether it affected the product's performance from a user experience standpoint, been told it did not, and moved the discussion to the next agenda item. The next agenda item had been the launch of the high concentration line, the XL products, the ones marketed to experienced users, The ones Marchand's team had found contained isopropyl nitrite at 2 to 3 times the concentration of standard formulations, which meant, given the stability data, that in conditions of warm storage or extended shelf life, the degraded mixture in those bottles could contain breakdown products at concentrations that made the original concentration figures look conservative. Priya asked whether the stability data had been filed anywhere, any regulatory body, any internal safety record, any document that existed outside Gerard's memory of a conference room in Rotterdam. He opened the shoulder bag. He had printed the documents before he left the company. Not systematically, not as part of a planned disclosure. He had printed them in the specific way that people print things when they are leaving a job and are not entirely sure why they feel the need to keep a copy, when the instinct to preserve precedes the conscious decision to do anything with what is preserved. 11 pages, internal quality control reports, stability data across 4 product lines, a summary memo authored by the company's head of chemistry that described the degradation issue and recommended further study. Further study. The same phrase from the REACH document, written 2 years later by a different person in a different country. The memo was dated October 2011. The high concentration line had launched in March 2012. Priya photographed every page with her phone. Gerard kept the originals. He had, it emerged over the course of the conversation, been carrying those 11 pages in a folder inside various bags and briefcases for 4 years, moving them from house to apartment to house again across 2 cities, through a marriage and a daughter and a career change, keeping them in the specific way that people keep things they haven't decided what to do with yet. He had decided now. The conversation ended. They parted outside the cafe. Priya walked back to her clinic along the South Bank with her phone in her bag and her mind running through the architecture of what she now knew, the full picture, assembled from a 2009 REACH document, 4 years of clinical data, Marchand's concentration analysis, and 11 pages printed in a Rotterdam facility by a man who had spent 4 years being unsure what they meant. She knew what they meant. The manufacturers had stability data showing their high concentration products became more toxic with age and heat. They had that data before the high concentration line launched. They had filed REACH documents acknowledging potential ocular toxicity. They had launched the products with not for human consumption labels and experienced user marketing, and no communication to the buyers, the sellers, or the people who would eventually end up in ophthalmology clinics with pale disruptions at the center of their retinal imaging. The gap between knowledge and action, between what the company knew and what the company did, was now documented, dated, and sitting on Priya's phone in 11 photographs. The question was what to do with it. The clinical paper was already in preparation. The multi-center study, 4 countries, 90-plus cases, Marchand's concentration data, the formulation timeline. It would be submitted to the British Medical Journal within months. But a peer-reviewed paper and a legal reckoning were 2 different things, and the documents Gerard had provided were not, in themselves, actionable without a legal mechanism to act through. She spent 3 days thinking. Then she contacted a solicitor who specialized in product liability. The solicitor's name was Nina Osei. She was based in Gray's Inn, had spent 12 years handling pharmaceutical product liability cases, and had a specific professional familiarity with the question of what a manufacturer knew, and when they knew it, and what gap between that knowledge and public disclosure constituted a legally cognizable harm. She read the documents Priya sent her, the REACH filings, the photographs of Gerard's 11 pages, the published clinical literature, over a weekend. She called Priya on the Monday. She said she needed to speak to the patients. Priya asked Daniel first. She called him on a Tuesday evening in August 2023. He was in the kitchen of the flat in Elephant and Castle, standing at the counter, which was what he did when he was on the phone now, stood at the counter so his hands had something to rest against. She explained what she'd found. She explained what Nina Osi did. She told him what this might mean, carefully, without over-promising, because Nina had been very clear about what the legal process did and didn't guarantee. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he asked one question. The documents, the stability data, the memo dated October 2011. Had the company known the high-concentration products were more dangerous specifically because of the degradation before they launched them? Priya told him yes. He was quiet again. Then he said he needed to think. He called her back the following morning. 3 weeks later, Priya contacted Tomasz through the Edinburgh colleague, who had been managing his follow-up care. Tomasz's response arrived by email, 6 lines, written in English that was careful and precise in the way that people write in their second language when the subject is serious. He said he'd been waiting for something like this without knowing he was waiting for it. He said yes. By October 2023, Nina Osi had 5 clients. Daniel and Tomasz were 2 of them. The others were from Priya's patient list. 3 more men, ages 24 to 38, from London and Bristol and Birmingham, with documented cases of Popper's maculopathy and documented purchase histories for the specific products covered by Gerard's internal documents. Nina filed a letter of claim to the Dutch manufacturer in November 2023. The manufacturer had 30 days to respond. On the day the letter arrived at their offices outside Rotterdam, in a building with white walls and a car park visible from the second-floor conference room, the website for their flagship high-concentration product was still running its promotional banner. Bestseller, new stock, recommended for experienced users. The orders kept coming in. Daniel didn't know about the orders. He didn't know about the banner. What he knew, in November 2023, sitting at the kitchen table in Elephant and Castle, with his laptop open and Siobhan playing her 4 bars of something complicated in the next room, was that the waiting, the particular suspended quality of the previous 2 years, the limbo of damage acknowledged and process trusted and self-reconfigured around new parameters, might be coming to an end. He opened the laptop. He looked at the screen for a moment. Then he got up and made coffee and stood at the counter and thought about something else entirely, because the alternative, holding the full weight of what had happened, all at once, without the buffer of routine, was a weight he had learned, over 2 years, to manage in increments rather than whole. The coffee finished. He went back to the table. Outside it was November. The streetlight on the corner of his road came on at 4:15 in the afternoon now, earlier every day, the way London announced the end of something without specifying what. The manufacturer's response arrived on the 28th day of the 30-day window. It was 8 paragraphs long, drafted in the careful, structurally evasive language of corporate legal correspondence. The kind of letter that says a great deal while committing to nothing, that acknowledges receipt without acknowledging content, that deploys concern as a syntactic device rather than an actual position. The core argument was in paragraph 4. The products were sold as room odorizers. The labelling clearly stated they were not intended for human consumption. Any use of the products by human beings constituted a deviation from the intended purpose, and under Dutch civil law, a manufacturer bore no liability for harms arising from the misuse of a product whose intended purpose had been clearly stated. The company expressed sympathy for any individuals who had experienced health difficulties. It denied that its products were the cause of those difficulties. It noted that the clinical literature on Popper's maculopathy, while emerging, remained inconclusive regarding causation at the individual level. Inconclusive regarding causation at the individual level. Nina Osi read the letter twice, made 3 notes in the margin, and called Priya. She said it was exactly what she'd expected. She said the not for human consumption defense was standard. It was the same mechanism used in analogous cases involving products sold for one purpose and used for another, from certain synthetic drug precursors to specific industrial solvents. She said it was not an insurmountable defense. She said the Gerard Foss documents were the key, because they established that the company had internal knowledge of the product's toxicity before the launch of the high-concentration line, which created a potential duty of care argument that the not-for-human consumption label did not automatically extinguish. She had been in contact with a Dutch law firm, cross-border product liability, long process, expensive, no guaranteed outcome. Daniel absorbed this information on a phone call while standing at the counter. He asked how long. Nina said 2 to 4 years if it went to litigation. She said she was also exploring whether a complaint to the Dutch Authority for the Financial Markets, which had consumer protection functions under Dutch law, might produce a faster regulatory response, and whether a parallel complaint to the UK's Competition and Markets Authority might apply pressure from the British side. 2 to 4 years. Daniel was 33. He put the phone down and looked at the counter. The multi-centre paper, Priya, Marchand, the Edinburgh Group and the Ghent team, was submitted to the British Medical Journal in December 2023. It covered 112 patients across 4 countries. It presented the clinical data, the chemical analysis of commercially available products, the formulation timeline, and the correlation between the introduction of high-concentration isopropyl nitrite products and the increase in clinical presentations. It was the largest study of Popper's maculopathy ever published. It went through peer review in 8 weeks, fast by the standards of the field, suggesting the reviewers understood the urgency. It was published in February 2024. The morning it went live, Priya's phone received 47 messages before 9 a.m. colleagues, journalists, a producer from a BBC health programme, 2 harm reduction organisations, a man in Glasgow who had been experiencing visual disturbances for 6 months and had just read the paper on his phone at 6 in the morning and was sending a message that was 5 lines long and ended with the words, "Is this what is happening to me?" She answered the Glasgow message first. The paper's publication created a pressure wave that moved through 3 systems simultaneously: the media, the medical establishment, and the regulatory infrastructure, at different speeds and with different effects. The media moved fastest. Within 48 hours, the study had been covered by The Guardian, the BBC, Le Monde, and Der Spiegel. The coverage was accurate in the broad outline and slightly variable in the details, as health journalism tends to be. Several articles led with the number, 112 patients, and several led with the legal status of the product, which was the element that produced the most reader response. Legal, openly sold, causing this. The combination had a quality of dissonance that made it shareable. The medical establishment moved at its own pace. Within 3 weeks of publication, the Royal College of Ophthalmologists issued guidance recommending that all ophthalmologists and optometrists ask about Popper's use in patients presenting with unexplained central visual disturbance. The guidance was overdue by approximately 2 years, but it was real, and it was distributed, and it would now be on the intake form of every eye clinic in the country within months. The regulatory infrastructure moved slowest, as it always does, as it is structurally required to do, because regulatory action without sufficient evidence is also harmful, and the institutions have learned, through decades of being wrong in both directions, to move only when the evidence is sufficient. The MHRA, which had responded to Priya's previous letters with courteous non-commitment, now acknowledged the published evidence in a formal statement. It announced an evidence review of isopropyl nitrite products. The review would take 6 to 12 months. In the meantime, the products remained on sale. This was the fact that Priya returned to in interviews, in correspondence, in her own mind on the bus home from the clinic, the temporal gap between evidence and action, the months during which the evidence existed and was acknowledged, and was being processed, and the product was still on the shelf, and the orders were still coming in. She understood why the gap existed. She had spent enough time working with institutions to understand the legitimate reasons for procedural caution. Understanding the reason didn't close the gap. The BBC programme aired in March 2024. It featured Priya and two of her patients, not Daniel, who had declined to appear on camera, and not Tomasz, who was not in London, but two men from her practice who had agreed to be filmed. One was 29, a nurse from Leeds who had moved to London 2 years earlier. The other was 35, a teacher from Cardiff who had been using poppers since university and had no idea the formula had changed. Both men had permanent central vision loss in at least one eye. Both men were filmed in the clinic where Priya worked, with the OCT imaging on the screen behind them, the pale disruption at the fovea visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The programme was watched by 1.4 million people. The harm reduction charity that had first connected Priya with Gerard Foss received more than 300 new inquiries in the week following the broadcast. People asking whether their own symptoms were related, people asking how to access testing, people asking whether the specific brand they were using was one of the ones in the study. The charity's website, designed for a visitor volume of a few hundred per month, crashed on the evening the programme aired and stayed down for 16 hours. Among the people who watched the programme that night was a 22-year-old student in Bristol named Owen Marsh, who had been using a high-concentration poppers product for 8 months and had, for the past 6 weeks, been experiencing a visual disturbance in his right eye that he had attributed to screen fatigue from his dissertation research. He watched the programme on his laptop. He covered his left eye. The smear in the centre of his right visual field was immediately and unmistakably present. He sat with that for a while. Then he opened a new tab and searched for how to make an emergency optician appointment. He got one the following morning. The optician referred him urgently. He saw a retinal specialist within the week. Faster than Daniel, faster than Tomasz, because the Royal College guidance was now in effect, and the question was now on the form, and the pathway had been opened by the work of people he would never meet. His case was early. The damage was present but limited. The specialist told him that ceasing use immediately gave him a reasonable chance of meaningful recovery. He stopped that day. He was 22. He would not know for another year how much would come back. The Dutch manufacturer had not responded to Nina Osi's follow-up correspondence. The complaint to the Dutch Consumer Authority was pending. The parallel UK process was moving through its preliminary stages. The website for the high-concentration product line was still live. The promotional banner had been replaced. Sometime in early 2024, nobody noted the exact date, with a new banner that said the company took customer safety seriously and was cooperating with ongoing regulatory reviews. The product was still listed, still available, still shipping in plain envelopes with customs declarations that said aromatic compound. The price had dropped by £2. Tomasz Wiśniewski, in Manchester, watched the BBC programme on catch-up, 3 days after it aired, sitting on his sofa with the overhead light on because his right eye needed the extra contrast now. He watched the imaging segment, the OCT scans, the explanation of the macula, the diagram of the photoreceptor layer, and recognised his own scans in the description. Not literally, he had never been filmed. But the clinical picture being described was his clinical picture, reproduced in the experience of two strangers on a screen, and the normalising effect of that recognition was something he had not anticipated and could not immediately categorise. He had not talked about it much. The friends he'd been with in the club that Saturday, the night he'd passed the bottle left and right with no thought whatsoever. Some of them knew in a general way. None of them knew the details. He had not told his family in Krakow. His mother called every Sunday and asked how he was, and he said fine. because the alternative was a conversation that required more translation than he had energy for. Not linguistic translation, but the translation of a specific English language subcultural harm into the frame of reference of a Polish family in Krakow for whom the word poppers meant nothing at all. He pulled the folded diagram out of his wintercoat pocket, still there, still creased along the same lines from 2 years of being moved from pocket to pocket, and looked at it for a while. Then he folded it back and put it away. The question of recovery, what it meant, how to measure it, where the line was between adaptation and healing, was one that all three of them were living inside from different positions. Daniel had adapted his career, his workflow, his daily visual habits to the parameters of what remained. He had stopped framing this as a temporary state pending restoration, and had started framing it as a permanent condition requiring design, which was, after all, his professional vocabulary. You worked with the constraints. You found the solution inside the limitation. His left eye had not changed in 2 years. The consultant's most recent assessment in early 2024 had used the word stable in the way that doctors use stable when they mean this is what it is now. His right eye had recovered partially, enough to be functional, not enough to be what it had been. He could read. He could see faces. He could not do the colour-critical, pixel-level work that had defined his professional identity for a decade. He had started drawing again, not digitally, but on paper, with charcoal, which worked differently, which required less precision and rewarded different things. The drawings were large and structural and not very much like graphic design. Siobhan had seen one on the kitchen table and asked if she could photograph it. He had said yes without particularly thinking about it. She posted it. Several people responded. He had not expected that and was not sure what to do with it. The legal case was moving. Nina had filed the formal claim in Dutch court in January 2024. The manufacturer had engaged a defence firm. The process was now in its procedural stages. Document disclosure, expert witness identification, the long institutional machinery of civil litigation grinding into motion. Nina had told Daniel to expect 18 months before anything resembling a hearing. He had noted this and returned to his daily life, because the alternative to returning to your daily life while legal proceedings move at their own pace is not having a daily life, and he had learned, by now, that the daily life was the point. The MHRA review was ongoing. The clubs were open, the bottles were on the shelves, and somewhere in a city that is not London or Manchester, in Berlin or Amsterdam or Barcelona or Montreal or Sydney, in a flat or a club or a bedroom, a person who has never heard of Popper's maculopathy, who has never heard of isopropyl nitrite, who has never heard of the EU ban or the formula change or the REACH documents or Priya Nair or Gerard Foss or Daniel Reyes, is opening an amber bottle for the first time, or the 50th time, or the 100th, because a friend handed it across in the dark, the way friends have been handing it across in the dark for 50 years, because everything they have ever been told about the bottle says it is old, and it is tested, and it is fine. The smear in the centre of their vision will arrive in 3 months, or 6, or 12, or it won't, and they will be lucky, and they will never know how close the thing came. The paramedics brought Daniel Reyes into University College Hospital at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. That sentence has a different weight now. The stretcher, the upright posture, the folded hands, the triage nurse who found his calm more unsettling than distress would have been. All of it lands differently when you know what the previous 18 months had looked like. The lockdown flat, the empty spare room, the bottle on the shelf that replaced the bottle on the shelf, the smudge that arrived on a Tuesday morning in March and never left, the GP appointment 3 weeks out, the ophthalmology appointment 16 weeks after that, the November consultant who paused before speaking in the way that meant the pause was itself information. By the time the paramedics brought him through those doors, Daniel had already been living inside the damage for the better part of a year. The emergency room was not the beginning of the crisis. It was the moment the crisis became visible to someone other than him. The jacket on the hook behind the curtain. The left pocket. The amber bottle had been in that pocket for 2 days. Not in active use. Not placed there deliberately. Just present the way objects become present when they have been part of the furniture of your life long enough. He had worn that jacket to a work meeting the previous Thursday. He had worn it on the bus. He had taken it off at home and hung it on the hook behind his bedroom door, and not thought about what was in the pocket because the bottle was simply part of the jacket, the way keys were part of the jacket. The skull and crossbones sticker had been put there by a friend at a party in Brixton in 2018, a friend whose name was Matteo, who was funny in the specific way that people are funny when they're performing for a room, who had found a sheet of skull stickers at a market and was putting them on things indiscriminately. Phones, cups, bottles. The joke was so low effort it barely qualified as a joke. Daniel had peeled the sticker off once, found the adhesive residue more irritating than the sticker, and stuck it back on. He had kept the bottle through 4 refills. Same brand, different contents each time the formula shifted, though he had no way of knowing that. The sticker had outlasted the original product. The transition to the XL formulation, the lockdown, the first smudge, the GP appointment, the ophthalmology referral, the November consultant, and the January scan. It was still there, slightly crooked, when the ophthalmologist at UCL photographed it as part of her documentation of the case. She photographed it because she had started photographing the bottles. It had become part of her intake process. Not official, not required, something she had started doing on her own after the 5th or 6th case, because the bottles were evidence and evidence needed to be preserved, and nobody else was preserving it. She had a folder on her desktop at the clinic. 41 photographs of 41 bottles, different labels, different brand names, all the same amber glass, all the same category of harm. The MHRA evidence review, announced in the wake of the BMJ paper's publication, reached its preliminary conclusions in September 2024. The review found sufficient evidence to support regulatory action on high-concentration isopropyl nitrite products. It recommended mandatory warning labelling. It recommended concentration limits. It recommended that products above a specified isopropyl nitrite threshold be reclassified from consumer products to regulated substances, requiring licensing for sale. These recommendations were not yet law. They moved into a consultation period, the formal process by which proposed regulatory changes are circulated to stakeholders for response before being enacted. Stakeholders included, by definition, the manufacturers. The consultation period was 12 weeks. The products remained on sale during the consultation period. The Dutch civil litigation reached its first substantive hearing in April 2025. The manufacturer's defence rested on 3 pillars. The not-for-human consumption labelling, the argument that causation at the individual level remained contested, and the claim that the REACH filings and Gerard Foss's internal documents represented routine safety monitoring rather than suppressed evidence of known harm. Nina Osi's argument rested on the October 2011 memo, the one dated 5 months before the high-concentration launch, the one in which the company's own head of chemistry had flagged the stability data and recommended further study and been moved past to the next agenda item. The next agenda item had been the launch meeting. The judge requested additional expert testimony on the question of whether the stability data in the October 2011 memo constituted sufficient knowledge of risk to establish a duty of care. The case was adjourned to October 2025. Danielle and Tomasz were both listed as claimants. Neither attended the April hearing. There was nothing for them to do there. The process did not require their presence, only their names on the filing and the documented evidence of their injuries, which had been photographed, scanned, measured, and filed with the precision that Priya Nair applied to everything she documented. A survey published in a European sexual health journal in early 2024 found that 61% of regular poppers users across 6 European cities – London, Amsterdam, Berlin, Paris, Barcelona, Brussels – had never heard of poppers maculopathy. 73% did not know the formula of commercially available products had changed after 2007. 81% believed the product they were currently using was the same product that had been used safely for decades. 81%. That number had a weight to it that no individual case could carry alone. 112 patients in a BMJ paper, 1.4 million viewers of a BBC programme, 47 messages on the morning of publication. A student in Bristol covering his left eye in front of a laptop. A man in Glasgow texting at 6 a.m. asking, "Is this what is happening to me?" All of it converging on the same gap. The distance between what was known and what was communicated, between what the bottle contained and what the label said, between the October 2011 memo and the March 2012 launch, and the 50 years of assumed safety that made everyone trust the bottle in the first place. The not for human consumption label was the final architecture of that gap. 4 words that did 2 jobs simultaneously: warning, which was its visible function, and shield, which was its actual one. A warning that no user interpreted as a genuine warning, because the product had been used by humans, recommended to humans, sold to humans, reviewed by humans, for 5 decades, and the label had always been there and nothing bad had always happened. And therefore the label was understood by everyone, including its authors, as a legal formality rather than a safety instruction, until it was needed as a defence. Then it became very literal indeed. The website for the XL product line was taken down in June 2024, not by regulatory order, not by court injunction, but voluntarily, after the BBC programme and the BMJ paper and the MHRA announcement, and what the manufacturer's PR team had presumably assessed as an untenable position in the public domain. The product was quietly delisted. Other products in the company's range remained available. New brands from other manufacturers filled the gap within weeks. Same compound, different name, same amber glass, same red cap, same website design that looked like a vitamin retailer, same discreet packaging guarantee. The market had a depth that individual regulatory actions could not immediately reach, because it was distributed across multiple jurisdictions, multiple manufacturers, multiple distribution networks, all operating in the same legal grey zone that had protected the product category since 1970. Daniel knew some of this. He followed the developments the way you follow the developments in a situation that involves you, but is no longer primarily about you, at a slight remove, with the specific detachment of someone who has already absorbed the personal consequence and is now watching the institutional consequence move at its own pace toward its own destination. He read the MHRA announcement. He read the survey about the 61%. He read the coverage of the April hearing with the particular attention of someone whose name was in the filing, looking for the details that the journalism smoothed over. He was still teaching at the design college. He had been given a slightly larger role, a full module now, not just assisting, covering the principles of visual communication for first-year students. He stood in front of rooms of 20-year-olds and talked about how the eye processes information, how the brain fills in gaps, how visual design works with perception rather than against it. He knew more about how the eye processes information than most design lecturers. He knew it from a direction that no curriculum had prepared him for. The charcoal drawings were ongoing. Siobhan had moved out in the spring, finished her degree, gone back to Cork, left a card on the kitchen counter with a drawing of a toast crumb on it that made him laugh. and the flat was his alone again, which suited the evenings better now. He drew at the kitchen table, large sheets of cartridge paper, architectural structures that weren't buildings, forms that suggested weight and space without committing to either. He had shown 3 of them in a small group exhibition at a gallery in Peckham in May, which was not something he had planned and was largely Siobhan's fault for posting the photograph that got the attention that led to the invitation. The opening night was on a Thursday. He stood in the gallery with a glass of wine and talked to people about the drawings, what they were, what they weren't, how he'd come to be making them, and found that the explanation was simple enough to give without the whole history, which was a relief. Someone asked if he was going to do more. He said he didn't know. He meant it as a genuine answer, and it was received as artistic evasiveness, which was fine. Tomasz went back to Canal Street in the summer of 2024. Not to a club specifically, to a bar on a Saturday afternoon with 2 friends, because the afternoon was warm and the canal was full of people, and the absence of that world had by then lasted long enough to become its own kind of loss that he hadn't agreed to. He sat outside. He drank a beer. His right eye managed the sunlight with more difficulty than his left, and he positioned himself slightly so the sun was behind him, a small adjustment that had become automatic. His friends talked. He listened. The afternoon had the quality of ordinary things that have been away and come back, slightly more vivid than before, slightly more worth the attention. He didn't mention the legal case. He did not mention the BMJ paper or the MHRA review, or the forum thread he'd found in December 2021, or the folded diagram still in the pocket of his winter coat. Some of it would come up eventually, in the way that things that have happened to you eventually come up. Not that afternoon. That afternoon was just the afternoon. In October 2025, the Dutch court reconvened for the second hearing. The expert testimony on the October 2011 memo had been filed. The judge had read it. The decision on whether to proceed to full trial was pending. Nina Ose had prepared for both outcomes, continuation and settlement, with the professional evenness of someone who had been in rooms like this enough times to know that the outcome of any individual case was never the whole point. The point was the documentation, the paper trail, the dated memo and the photographed bottles and the 90-plus patient files and the multi-centre study and the REACH filings and the 11 pages that Gerard Foss had carried in various bags across 2 cities for 4 years without knowing exactly why. The point was that it existed now in the record, in a form that could not be unfiled or unpublished or relabeled as room odorizer. There is a survey. 61% have never heard of it. Tonight, in a club in a city with a canal running through it, someone is being handed a bottle by someone they trust. The music is good. The night has that quality of expansion. The bottle passes left. It passes right. The label says not for human consumption, which everyone has always understood to mean nothing in particular. The person who passes it right is 24 years old and has been using the same brand for 2 years without a problem, which means they were lucky, or the damage is still accumulating silently in a place that doesn't hurt, in a layer of cells that have not yet thinned past the threshold where the brain stops compensating. They don't know which one it is. Neither does anyone else in that club. Neither does the website that sold them the bottle, which is still running, still shipping, still displaying a star rating of 4.7 out of 5 based on 612 customer reviews, the most recent of which was posted 3 days ago and says simply, "Best product on the market, exactly what I needed, we'll order again."